Close your eyes for a second. Picture your morning. You wake up, you reach for a glass of water, you brush your teeth, you shower, you make coffee. Now imagine none of that exists. Not because you forgot to pay a bill, not because of a broken pipe down the street, but because the water is simply gone. Every single civilization in human history, every empire, every city, every society that ever rose to greatness was built next to water. The Romans had their aqueducts. The Egyptians had the Nile. The Mesopotamians had the Tigris and Euphrates. Water wasn't just a resource, it was the reason any of it existed at all. So what happens when it runs out? This isn't science fiction. This isn't some distant nightmare from a movie screen. This is already happening, and most people have no idea how close we already are. Here's something that should stop you cold. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, has lost over 170 feet of water level in the last 2 decades. 170 feet. They actually have a name for what that leaves behind. They call it the bathtub ring, a pale white scar on the canyon walls that marks exactly how far the water has fallen. And Lake Mead isn't alone. Lake Chad in Africa, it's shrunk by 90% since the 1960s. 90%. A body of water that once fed 30 million people is now a ghost of itself, surrounded by cracked desert that used to be a shoreline. The Colorado River, the lifeblood of the American West, the source of water for 40 million people, ran completely dry before even reaching the ocean for years at a stretch. Before we go further, take a second and drop a comment below. I want to know, did you already know how serious the global water crisis is? Or is this news to you? Because the answer to that question says a lot about why we're in this situation. Now, let's go deeper. We need to understand something first. When scientists and water experts talk about running out of water, they don't mean all the water on Earth disappears overnight. That's not how this works. Earth is covered in water. We all learned that in school. 71% of the surface is water. But here's the thing they don't teach you. Of all that water on Earth, only about 3% is fresh. And of that 3%, more than 2/3 is locked inside glaciers and polar ice caps, places we can't easily access. The water that actually feeds rivers, lakes, underground aquifers, the water that we drink, grow food with, and survive on, accounts for less than 1% of all water on the planet. Less than 1%. And we are burning through it like there's no tomorrow. Beneath parts of Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska lies the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the largest underground freshwater sources in the world. For decades, American farmers have been pumping it up to irrigate crops. It feeds a huge portion of the food supply for the entire country. But here's what nobody talks about at the dinner table. Parts of the Ogallala are being depleted 100 times faster than it naturally refills. In some areas, it could be functionally gone within decades. And once an ancient aquifer like that collapses, it doesn't come back. Not in our lifetime, not in our children's lifetime, not in 1,000 lifetimes. Think about what that actually means for a moment. No aquifer, no irrigation, no crops, no food on supermarket shelves, no food, and suddenly the water crisis stops being about thirst and starts being about everything else. About survival, about power, about who eats and who doesn't. This is where it gets really dark. Did you know that some of the most brutal conflicts of the last 30 years had water at their core? Not oil, not land, water. The Syrian Civil War, one of the deadliest humanitarian disasters of the 21st century, was preceded by the worst drought in Syria's recorded history. Between 2006 and 2010, a 4-year drought devastated farms, drove millions of rural Syrians into crowded cities, collapsed livelihoods, and created a powder keg of desperation. The conflict that followed had many causes, but drought lit the fuse. Military researchers have a term for this. They call water the new oil. The Pentagon has classified water scarcity as a national security threat. Multiple studies from top intelligence agencies around the world agree. The wars of the future won't be fought over land or ideology. They'll be fought over rivers. Right now, today, while you're watching this, Egypt and Ethiopia are locked in a dispute over the Nile River that has gone to the edge of open conflict. Ethiopia built a massive dam that controls how much Nile water flows into Egypt. Egypt, a country of over 100 million people, where almost every drop of fresh water comes from the Nile, sees this as an existential threat. And honestly, both of them are right. This is the terrifying logic of a water-scarce world. There are no villains, just desperate people fighting over survival. And that conflict on the Nile, it's not unique. There are over 200 river systems in the world that cross international borders, over 200 potential flashpoints, over 200 places where a drought, a dam, or a policy decision could light a war. Meanwhile, glaciers, which supply fresh water to more than 2 billion people worldwide, are disappearing at rates that are accelerating every decade. The glaciers in the Himalayas feed the rivers that sustain South Asia. Over 1 billion people in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and China depend on that glacial meltwater. When those glaciers are gone, the rivers start to die. And here's what keeps scientists up at night. The loss isn't linear. It doesn't happen slowly and evenly. It happens in stages, and then suddenly, catastrophically, like a dam that holds for years and years and years, and then just doesn't. Here's the part of this story that most people never get to hear, because up until now, you might be thinking, okay, this is serious, but surely we can fix it. Desalination, technology, human ingenuity, we put a man on the moon, right? We'll figure it out. And there's truth in that. Desalination, pulling fresh water from seawater, is real. It works, and it's being used right now in places like Saudi Arabia and Israel and parts of California. But here's the brutal reality nobody puts in the headline. Desalination is expensive, it requires enormous amounts of energy, and it produces a toxic byproduct, a super concentrated brine that, when dumped back into the ocean, destroys marine ecosystems. We're not at a point where desalination can replace natural freshwater systems at the scale we need. Not even close. There's something else. Something that breaks the entire logic of technology will save us. Water is being privatized. Right now, across the world, multinational corporations are buying up water rights. They're acquiring sources, aquifers, and distribution systems in places where governments are too financially desperate or too corrupt to protect them. In parts of South America, Africa, and even the United States, communities have woken up to discover that the water beneath their land, water their grandparents drank, water that fed their farms for generations, now belongs to a private company. And that company sets the price. This is the real twist. The real crisis isn't just physical scarcity. It's that water, the one thing every human being needs to survive, is being treated like a commodity, like something to be owned and sold to the highest bidder. And if that system fully takes hold before we address the physical scarcity, the world doesn't just run out of water, it runs out of water for the poor. Think about that image for a moment, because that future isn't hypothetical. In Cape Town, South Africa, in 2018, the city came within weeks of becoming the first major modern city to literally run out of water. They called it Day Zero, the day the taps would go dry. Wealthy residents bought bottled water by the truckload. Poor communities waited in rationing lines. They narrowly avoided it, but the scientists who studied that near collapse have been very clear. Cape Town was a preview, not an exception. So, could humanity survive a world without water? Technically, no. The human body starts failing after 3 days without it. At a civilizational level, the collapse would happen faster than most people could comprehend. Agriculture first, then mass migration, then conflict, then everything else we've built. Every institution, every economy, every government would fracture under the weight of that single absence. But that's not really the right question. The right question is this: are we going to let it get there? Because here's the thing that doesn't make headlines. The thing that gets buried under the fear and the statistics and the worst case scenarios. People are fighting back hard. Water reclamation technology has made extraordinary leaps. Cities like Singapore have turned wastewater into drinking water so clean it meets international standards. Indigenous communities across North America are winning legal battles to protect their water rights. Countries that once seemed hopelessly water insecure have built systems that stretch every drop. Israel, a country in one of the most arid regions on Earth, now recycles over 85% of its wastewater. 85%! It's become one of the most water efficient nations in human history. Not because they got lucky with geography, but because they decided water was worth fighting for. The solutions exist. What's missing isn't technology. What's missing isn't even money. What's missing is the collective will to treat water as the sacred, irreplaceable thing that it actually is. Not a commodity, not a resource, not a line item in a budget. The foundation of everything. Every time you turn on a tap, you're drawing from a system that took millions of years to build. Every river, every aquifer, every raindrop that filters through rock and soil to reach you. All of it is part of something ancient and irreplaceable. And right now, we are making decisions, today in this generation, that will determine whether the people who come after us have enough. That's not someone else's problem, that's ours. If this documentary made you see the world a little differently, even just for today, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the stories that don't make the front page but probably should, because there are more of them than you think, and the next one might be even closer to home.